October 1947, Warsaw, Poland. The courtroom smells faintly of damp wood and cold ash, as if the city itself still remembers what fire feels like. Outside, Warsaw is rebuilding, brick by brick, street by street, trying to assemble something whole from what had been deliberately broken. Inside, however, nothing is being rebuilt. Here things are being examined. At the center of the room sits a man who does not move, Erich von dem Bach, former SS general, one of the men tasked with suppressing resistance across vast stretches of Eastern Europe. A man now accused of ordering the destruction of 86 villages, not in battle, not in chaos, but as policy. Witnesses pass before him one by one. A woman whose hands are scarred so deeply they seem carved rather than burned. A farmer who speaks slowly, when as if each word must push through years of silence, describing how he buried 6 children in a single trench. A former German soldier who admits, almost in a whisper, "We were not fighting enemies. We were erasing them." Von dem Bach does not look at them. He stares straight ahead, his face composed, his body rigid in a plain gray suit that replaces the authority he once wore. The uniform is gone. The posture remains. Today is not about territory or victory. It is about responsibility. The prosecutor approaches with a single sheet of paper. No flourish, no dramatics, just a list. 86 names, villages, gone. He places it on the table between them and asks with quiet precision, "Did you give the order, knowing what it would mean?" For the first time, von dem Bach lifts his eyes, and in that moment, the question is no longer confined to the courtroom. What does a man have to believe to justify burning entire communities? To understand the answer, you have to leave the courtroom behind and step into a very different kind of war. In Eastern Europe, this was not a war defined by front lines and uniforms. It was a war that moved through forests, across fields, and into villages where soldiers could not always tell who was an enemy and who was simply trying to survive. Partisans, resistance fighters, did not stand in formation. They struck quickly, sabotaged supply lines, ambushed convoys, and then disappeared back into the landscape. To the German command, this made them not just dangerous, but unpredictable, and unpredictability in that system demanded control. The doctrine that emerged did not treat civilians as neutral. Entire populations were labeled as potential collaborators. If resistance fighters relied on villages for shelter, food, or information, then those villages became part of the battlefield. Or more precisely, they became targets. The policy that followed was called anti-partisan warfare. It sounded clinical, strategic. In reality, it meant something far simpler. If an attack came from a region, that region would suffer. Not investigation, not arrest, erasure, homes burned, supplies destroyed, people executed or displaced, not because of what they had done, but because of where they were. By the early 1940s, these operations had escalated. Reports sent back to headquarters began listing not just captured fighters, but numbers of civilians killed. Entire settlements categorized in cold language that reduced lives to statistics. And overseeing many of these operations was Erich von dem Bach. He was not an outsider to the system. He had grown within it. Born in East Prussia, he had built a career on discipline, loyalty, and efficiency. By his late 40s, he had reached one of the highest ranks within the SS Obergruppenführer. It was a position that demanded not just obedience, but initiative. Those who worked under him described a man who was focused, controlled, and results-driven. He understood what was expected, and he delivered it. But there were signs that something beneath that control was unstable. He suffered from recurring episodes of exhaustion, periods where he would be removed from duty due to what doctors described as stress. Whether it was physical or psychological was never fully clear. What was clear was that he was not known as a man driven by ideology alone. He was a pragmatist, a man who believed his role was to restore order, eliminate resistance, and do what was necessary to achieve those goals. The problem was that the definition of necessary was not fixed. It expanded, and it was shaped by the expectations of those above him. At the top of that hierarchy was Heinrich Himmler. Himmler did not see fear as a consequence of control. He saw it as the method. His directives regarding partisan warfare were explicit. Resistance must be crushed not only by eliminating fighters, but by destroying the conditions that allowed them to exist. Villages were not just places where people lived. In this framework, they were support systems for the enemy, and support systems in war were to be dismantled. Himmler measured success in numbers. Reports did not describe stories or individuals. They listed outcomes. Bandits eliminated, areas secured, settlements cleared, each line a calculation, each number a signal of efficiency. For officers like von dem Bach, these numbers were not abstract. They were expectations. To fail to produce them was to fail entirely, and failure in that system carried consequences. It was within this environment that a moment arrived that would define everything that followed. In the spring of 1943, a German convoy was ambushed near a cluster of villages in Belarus. The attack itself was not large. Only a few soldiers were killed, but it was enough to trigger a response. The resistance was active, growing. Von dem Bach received the directive soon after: suppress the region completely. Not just the fighters, but the network that sustained them, the villages, the surrounding areas, everything connected to the possibility of resistance. But as reports came in, something complicated the situation. Some of the villages identified for action showed no confirmed partisan activity, no weapons caches, no sightings of fighters, just families, farmers, children, people who happened to live within a designated zone. Von dem Bach studied the map. He understood the order. He understood what was expected, and he understood what would happen if he carried it out fully. For the first time, the logic of the system and the reality of its consequences did not align cleanly. He had to choose. At first, the decisions were framed as operational. Field commanders asked for clarification. How far should the orders extend? Which settlements qualified as targets? Some officers hesitated, others did not. Initial operations moved forward. A handful of villages were destroyed. The reports came back quickly, efficient, controlled, successful. But they were inconsistent. Some units exercised restraint, limiting destruction to specific areas. Others expanded their actions, interpreting the orders broadly. Von dem Bach recognized the danger in that inconsistency. Ambiguity led to unpredictability, and unpredictability, in his view, weakened authority. So he clarified the directive: wider authority, fewer restrictions. The results were immediate. The numbers began to rise. At some point, numbers stopped being abstract, even to those who produced them. During an inspection, von dem Bach visited a village that had recently been cleared. The fires were still burning. The air carried a smell that was unmistakable once recognized and impossible to forget afterward. He walked through what had been a school. The structure was partially collapsed, blackened beams cutting through the gray sky. In the mud outside, a single child's shoe lay half buried. Nearby, a soldier stood motionless, staring at nothing. Another turned away, retching behind a wall that no longer stood fully upright. This was no longer a report, it was consequence. And yet, when the reports were sent back to Berlin, they remained unchanged in tone. Operation successful. The gap between reality and documentation widened. Among the ranks, something began to shift. Some officers quietly questioned the scale of the operations, and on others doubled down, becoming harsher, more aggressive, perhaps to prove loyalty, perhaps to silence their own doubts. Von dem Bach himself began to show signs of strain. He experienced severe stress episodes and was temporarily removed from duty. Officially, it was exhaustion. Unofficially, those close to him suspected something more complicated. When he returned, there was no adjustment in expectations. If anything, the pressure had increased. The resistance had not disappeared. The demand for results had not lessened. And so the operations continued. 86 villages would eventually be listed, each one a point on a map, each one a decision made, carried out, recorded. Back in the Warsaw courtroom, those decisions are no longer distant. They are being examined one by one through testimony and evidence. The prosecutor stands again, his voice steady. "You were not a junior officer," he says. "You were in command." Von dem Bach remains still. "You had the authority to interpret orders." A pause. "To limit them, if you chose." The room is silent, waiting. When von dem Bach finally speaks, his voice is controlled. "We were fighting an enemy that did not wear uniforms," he says. "They hid among civilians. They relied on them." The prosecutor steps closer. "And so you decided to destroy the civilians?" Von dem Bach's jaw tightened slightly. "I followed orders necessary to maintain control." "Necessary," the prosecutor repeats, lifting the list of villages. 86 villages. Was that necessary? For a moment, the composure slips. Not visibly to everyone, but enough. Von dem Bach looks at the document. "And if we had not acted," he says quietly, "the resistance would have grown. More would have died." The prosecutor does not raise his voice. "And so you chose who would die first." The words hang in the air. They do not need to be repeated. When the judgment is delivered, it does not restore what was lost. It cannot. Von dem Bach is sentenced to prison. Not for each village individually, not in a way that maps cleanly onto the scale of what occurred, but for his role within the system that carried it out. As he is led away, he does not protest. He does not look back. Outside, Warsaw continues its slow reconstruction. Buildings rise where ruins once stood. Streets fill again. Life returns unevenly, imperfectly. But some places do not return. The 86 villages remain names on a list, spaces where something used to exist. When the trial does not bring them back, what it does is force a confrontation, not just with actions, but with the reasoning behind them. Years later, historians would debate that reasoning. Some argue that von dem Bach was operating within a system that left little room for refusal, that the structure of command, the expectations, and the consequences of disobedience limited his choices. Others argue that authority does not remove responsibility, it increases it. That having the power to interpret orders includes the responsibility to limit harm. That ambiguity was not just a constraint, it was an opportunity, and that he chose how to use it. The truth does not settle easily into one side or the other. It sits somewhere in between, in the space where systems and individuals intersect, which is why the question remains. If you had been in his position, Would you have followed orders to maintain control or refused, knowing it could cost you everything? And if you want more World War II stories that explore the decisions behind the history, make sure you subscribe.